Empires announce themselves with drums. This one learned to whisper through forests, icons, and winter roads. Trace the whisper, and you'll hear the century turn. Tonight, we journey into the story of the Russian Empire. The birch forests breathe a silver hush as you walk along river paths older than names. Frost hangs like fine glass in the air. Northern light rings against trunks as if the world were a bell. You follow waters that braid from marsh to lake to strong current, a veined map that gathers timber palisades into a single slow heartbeat. Wooden churches lift from hills like candles. You might struggle to endure what they once lived through. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pass under Novgorod's walls and hear the lapping of the Volkhov against stone. Traders ease bales of fur and wax from shallow boats, and the air smells of tar and wet rope. In the market square, the vetch bell waits in its frame, quiet yet ready. In a scriptorium, a boy presses a stylus into birch bark. The bark curls, and brief words travel through time with the tenderness of a note to a friend. You drift south along the Dnieper. High bluffs rise, and a patient city gathers its houses on the hills. You sense the hush that falls during the great baptism by the river. People step into cold water and climb out shining. Icons gleam in priestly hands. The scent of frankincense mingles with wet linen and riverstone. You trace the roads that run to the Baltic and the Black Sea. Boats move under square sails along caravan routes of water. Finnic, Slavic, Norse, and Greek syllables weave together and make a bronze wind of speech. In that weave, you hear Varangian names arrive with ship timbers and steel. You hear local names that keep fields and groves. The land prefers confluence over division. You sit in the nave of a timber church and let your breath take the rhythm of chant. The choir lifts a line that arches like smoke from a hearth. Someone traces a cross, a movement as natural as setting bread on a table. Candlelight shivers over painted faces. You remember a winter track where sled runners whisper over a crust of snow. At a crossroads, a carved post marks the place, its surface cut with signs that half remember old gods and half welcome the new. A woman ties a strip of cloth in the branches of a birch for safe travel. The air holds its breath between eras. Customs settle into one another until the seam is almost invisible. You ride with a princely train that shivers with mail and horse tack. Riders move toward a wooden fort that creaks in wind. The chronicle keeps names like beads on a cord. Oleg lays a firm hand on the helm. Olga rules with a steady calm. Sviatoslav goes like a spear into the open grass. Vladimir brings the faith of Constantinople into the north. The pattern bends like the river that carries it. You pause with a single moment that holds the weight of a century. The baptism in the Dnieper fills banks and halls with water light. The city listens. A prince steps under the surface and rises, and law and prayer join hands. The moment turns and radiates through time. You feel it touch Novgorod and Suzdal, Pskov and Smolensk, and the timber domes that rise and darken with age. The tone differs in each place, yet the center holds. You notice how the road south bends towards steppe. Hooves drum at the edge of hearing. Messengers arrive wind-burned and speak of riders, tribute, and open grass that swallows distance. Cities fold their strength inward and watch the horizon. In this watchfulness, the habit of gathering under a stronger hand begins to grow. Towers thicken, courts learn to answer in a single voice. A center forms that will draw iron and oath toward itself like a lodestone. You sense another current, quiet and strong, that runs east through forests beyond the Urals. Hunters trace rivers into gray dawn. Furs move west in silent caravans. Monks follow with bells wrapped in cloth to keep them from sounding over ice. Footsteps mark a faith that lives far from marble and gold. It enters log walls and winter kitchens and carries warmth into long nights. A lullaby sounds like a prayer, and a prayer sounds like a lullaby. You follow the chain of roads to distant colonies of trade. Salt, fur, and iron flow towards cities that call themselves mothers of many towns. You see small forts on sandbanks and deep barns full of smoked fish. You feel the pull of empire before the word enters speech, a soft pressure that tells tributary villages where to turn their eyes when the bell rings. The pull is not yet a command. It grows as habit and loyalty. You enter a hall where a scribe copies law on bright sheets. The ink smells warm and bitter. Letters look precise and patient. A reader lifts a page and the edge catches light like thin ice. Words grant weight to oaths. They grant memory to speech. Justice is not perfect in these rooms, yet each careful line makes the next line easier to write. You consider what remains uncertain beneath layers of chronicle and song. The first ruler who gathers these lands carries a name that feels forged. The figure stands like iron. The traces around him blur like mist. The first bond between shipmen and field folk does not reveal itself fully. It lives under water and moves when you try to hold it. The river keeps the secret. You accept the mystery and let the current carry you forward. You close the section in the hush before dawn. A deacon fills a censer with resin that smells of honeyed wood. An ember takes, smoke rises, and the bell answers with a single round note. You breathe as the note fades. These early centuries give the land a patience that will carry through storms. You step into frost. The rivers lie dark, the sky grows pale, and the world feels cleared for morning. You step from river mist into streets that fold toward a single hill, and you feel how the lanes lean inward as if drawn by an unseen tide. The citadel above you wears timber and stone, and the bell that once called markets now seems to call lands. Smoke drifts from bathhouses. Snow rests on roof ridges like quiet hands. The city listens for a voice that will gather scattered threads and bind them into a warmer cloth. You watch caravans arrive with tribute measured in winter weight. Officials carry tall staves and careful ledgers. The habit of answering to one table deepens with each season. You sense how the horsemen of the open grass still ride at the edge of memory, how their shadow shapes methods of rule, how their messengers once counted silver and fur in weighed heaps. That shadow does not vanish. It melts into new rooms and finds a different roof. You stand before gates where a white stone enclosure gives way to fresh brick that glows like coals under dusk. Builders speak a language from distant peninsulas and set plumb lines with a calm that settles workers who watch and learn. Cathedrals rise with clean arches. A square becomes an altar of streets. The Cathedral of the Dormition gathers a new rhythm for coronations and council. You hear psalms press against fresh plaster, and gold leaf takes light like still water. You walk with a procession that carries an icon through narrow lanes. The crowd parts like quiet reeds and closes again after the holy face passes. You feel how such processions make a city walk as one body. The smoke of incense clings to wool and hair. Children lift candles in both hands. A thin snow begins to fall and melts on warm wax. The chant does not hurry. It carries the measure of power that chooses to convince by steadiness. You follow a courier along the northern road to a city that once ruled its own bell. A sovereign seal opens bags of proclamations. Land charters shift. The market turns its head toward a new center. A bell travels out of town on a cart, bound for the hill that gathers all. Boards creak under its weight. Women fold shawls tighter. Men rest hands on axe shafts. You feel the veil between consent and command, woven of fear and hope, drawn across faces that do not speak. You return to Moscow as a marriage procession enters in winter light. The bride brings a name that breathes of domes beyond the Black Sea. Robes rustle like small waves. A thin circlet holds jewels that carry the memory of a fallen city of emperors. In a palace room, a seal is pressed into wax and a bird with two heads opens its wings. One face turns east. One face turns west. The emblem rests its claws on scepters that seem new and ancient at once. You feel the coat of arms move from banner to seal, from seal to tile, from tile to wall. The sign multiplies through courts and stations until it sits easy in the mind. You cannot always tell whether it promises protection or claim. You stand beneath it and think of the marriage bed where power reorients itself without a sound. Some later whispers will speak of an inheritance of empire. Others will hear only practical shelter after loss. The emblem itself keeps counsel. You ride with a column that takes the road toward the Ugra. Autumn has stained the banks a deep brown. The two hosts watch one another from opposite sides. Hooves stamp frost from dead grass. The river runs quiet. The standoff holds while winter tightens its belts. No battle, only the slow tilt of fear and resolve. You sense that power ends here without a cry. A chain of tribute loosens. The air feels wider. The campfires burn with a particular satisfaction. You enter offices where clerks trim quills and smooth their sleeves. A code is set down that gives new courts weight and gives old customs clean edges. The articles speak of theft and oath and property. Travel papers carry seals that allow passage through checkpoints. You read by lamplight and feel a state teaching itself to speak in legal sentences. The writing itself is a discipline. It turns force into order and asks everyone to breathe in a common rhythm. You pass work yards where bricks bake in long kilns and stacks of timbers season in dry sheds. Rope coils and iron studs lie sorted in bins. The craft of a realm grows in such yards. You watch a mason teach his son to sight a straight line with the eye alone. Snow begins to fall again. The lad looks up and closes one eye to measure an angle against a roofline. Skill enters the body and will serve it for a lifetime. You walk into a treasury where silver bowls sit beside belts set with small plaques. Gifts reach the capital like tributary streams. You lift a piece of fur and feel a softness that once warmed a living animal in a forest moons away. Goods carry the scent of the path they traveled. They also carry allegiance. You can tell by the way the chancellor's clerk notes each item that the empire takes shape through items as much as through oaths. You sit in a chamber where boyars listen with faces that reveal nothing. Their calendars are full of estates and hunts, their sleeves rich with braid. The sovereign has learned how to draw their power into his own without snapping the cord. A marriage places kin among them. A law trims their reach. An office rewards service. A boundary line shifts on a map. It happens slowly, like the way a great river grinds a bend wider without breaking the bank. You feel a thought move under the floorboards of the palace. It passes from monk to clerk to courtier, not in proclamations, but in prayers and hints. A city destroyed far away leaves a vacancy that invites a claim. The claim does not step into the room. It waits at the threshold like a traveler at dusk. You cannot tell whether the thought seeks destiny or shelter. It lives in the pauses between psalms where breath gathers. You return to the square where markets fill the morning. A woman lifts a loaf that smells of rye and caraway. A man pours hot kvass into a ladle and hands it to a friend. Bells mark the hours with a tone that belongs only to this hill. The procession from the cathedral meets the stream of carts and peddlers, and for a moment devotion and trade share the same cobbles without friction. That moment explains more than a decree can. You stand again by the new walls, red against snow, and let your breath frost the air. You feel how all of this rises from patience and hunger, from fear remembered and hope learned day by day. A city has taught itself to be a hand that opens and closes with purpose. A land has learned to turn many pathways toward a single fire. What seems simple when told in one sentence actually rests on countless quiet decisions that no chronicle records. The center holds because people decide to walk toward it. You enter a winter morning that carries the weight of a coronation day. Frost paints the river like a quiet mirror. The city waits for a young ruler whose childhood has known too many locked doors and sudden silences. You move with the procession along narrow streets where fresh straw deadens the sound of hooves. The cathedral rises pale and sure, its domes gathering what the town cannot yet say aloud. Inside, candles lift their honeyed light. A crown waits on a cushion that breathes purple. A scepter rests beside an orb that reflects the nave in a trembling round world. The boy steps forward and the air tightens. A priest sets the crown upon his head and a title passes into him like a slow fire. Tsar. The word settles into stone, into banners, into every mouth that will speak power from this day. You feel the title change the room. A prince among princes becomes a sovereign who claims a realm that stretches beyond names. The choir's chant lengthens. People cross themselves in a single ripple that runs like wind through wheat. The new ruler receives the anointing oil and a cross that has traveled far from the city of emperors that once guarded the straits. The embrace of that memory gives him a frame made from older iron. You watch his eyes search the faces gathered under the vaults, nobles and clerics and servants, each measuring the shape of the years now beginning. Outside, snow gathers on the shoulders of statues. The square holds its breath and then releases it in relief and uncertain hope. You follow the days that come after the crown. Councils begin with early light. Decrees harden into clean sentences that carry through halls and over river ice. Messengers ride to towns that will learn a new rhythm. You watch how the title teaches the land to listen for a single voice. The court sets a calendar of judgments and blessings. A feast marks the season, yet the ruler eats as if the food were a duty, not a delight. Boyars bow with careful economy. Servants run the length of corridors that smell of wax and fur. A city that once negotiated with neighbors now gathers itself into a body that stands straighter. You ride east in spring as the sovereign turns his face toward a fortress that has long carried a different standard. The river unfurls like a steel ribbon under the sky. Banners fold and open above columns that move with patience rather than haste. You spend nights in camps where a small chapel of canvas glows with lamplight. Icons ride in carts, cushioned with cloth. The army arrives and lays a ring of wood and earth around high walls. Drums keep a heartbeat. The artillery speaks with a sound that walks across the ground and enters your bones. A gate buckles. A standard falls. You hear the city's name carried on the wind with awe and fear. Kazan opens to a new center. The victory shapes maps and confidence. It also reshapes prayers, since the faith of the conquerors and the faith of the conquered now share markets and alleys and the same winter river. The change asks merchants, judges, and priests to learn a wider grammar of the realm. You move south and feel the same long current draw the mouth of the Volga toward the crown. Astrakhan bends and the river becomes a road that runs the empire into salt air. Fishermen mend their nets as new officials count the catch. The wind smells of reeds and brine. Caravans that once skirted the border now enter under banners they did not expect to salute. The ruler carries trophies home, not only in silver and silk, but in the knowledge that distance can be persuaded to kneel. The steppe listens and keeps its counsel. You return to the capital and enter a summer that grows too hot and dry. Smoke begins in a single quarter and runs like a bad dream through streets of wood. Fire takes roofs and leaps alleys. Bells ring from towers until ropes burn through and drop to stone. People run with buckets that make too small a difference. By night, the city is a crown of coals under a dome of sparks. The dawn reveals blackened beams and ash where houses once breathed. Accusations move like wasps. Grief finds a face and blames it. The ruler rides through ruins that smell of wet embers. He hears cries that are older than law. The city needs order and comfort in equal measure. You sit in a dark chamber where the sovereign shapes a thought that will ride out like a storm. He takes a portion of his realm for himself and gives it a name that sounds like a cord pulled tight. Men in black coats and capes appear with wolfhound eyes. Their saddles creak. Their whips hang like questions that never need to be asked. Villages feel hooves on frosted lanes at midnight. Gates open to hands that carry seals and lists. The land learns a new way of listening, not to a law that speaks the same to many, but to a moving boundary that can step over a threshold and turn any house into a court. The aim of this creation remains a room with no windows. Some say it hunts treachery wherever it hides. Some say it feeds on fear and grows strong on the taste. The truth moves behind curtains and leaves only footprints. You walk through streets where heads turn toward the sound of bells, uncertain whether the tone means prayer or warning. The palace divides itself into quieter rooms. The former companions of childhood step carefully. A circular chapel fills with long services that soothe a mind that tries to hear certainty in the Psalms. You feel how that mind can carry tenderness for chant and fury for betrayal in the same hour. The servants learn to read the day by the weight of footsteps in the hall. You leave the city again and ride toward forests that hum with flies in high summer. Merchants of salt and fur gather in the houses of a wealthy family that holds lands near the Ural Mountains. They speak of a frontier full of silver streams and tall grass, of tribes who can read the steppe by the bend of a stalk, of a river that runs east and then north until it forgets where it began. The ruler grants letters that allow these merchants to raise a small army of free riders whose saddles are light and whose patience is long. Cossacks answer the call with weathered faces and easy laughter around the fire. A captain named Yermak shapes the river into a road and finds himself in a town whose timber walls look brave and thin under a wide sky. Battles happen in a noise of arrows and smoke. A cloak of snow settles over new forts that seem too far from everything to be possible. The frontier opens not all at once, but like a door that catches on the threshold and then swings free. You return to Moscow with this news riding ahead of you. The court hears of sable and pine, of copper and iron, of people with songs that hold the measure of winter. The realm grows in a way that a map can show with a line, yet the real growth lies in the habit of sending orders into distances that once felt like myth. A scribe copies names that are not easy for his hand and smiles at the challenge. A bell rings in a small chapel beyond the Ural Ridge, and the sound loses itself in verse, and the faintest echo answers from the mind of the capital. You feel time turn. The ruler grows older. Loss touches him in rooms hung with icons. A beloved dies. A city whispers. The hand that writes decrees tightens. The temper that once made plans now breaks like an oar against submerged rock. A blow falls where it should not. The sound of that mistake never leaves the corridors. The throne carries a sadness shaped like iron. You stand near the royal tombs and let the chill of the stones pass into you. The air smells of beeswax and cold limestone. You end the day under a sky washed clean by fresh snow. The city lies quiet. The title of Tsar remains on the cushion where it sleeps between ceremonies. Soldiers walk their rounds. Monks tuck their hands into sleeves and move along cloisters that know every season. The realm is larger than it was on the morning of the crown. It is also more frightened than it knows how to say. The road east now holds tracks that will deepen. The river south has learned the shape of new walls. In the hush, you sense how power can grow while a heart grows tight. The bells measure the hour. You breathe with them until the air feels gentle again and the city returns to sleep. You wake to a throne that sits in a hush too large for one room. The crown rests on velvet that remembers warmer hands. A gentle ruler with a prayerful heart lifts it when needed and sets it down with care. The work of command slides to a brother by marriage who knows ledgers and fortresses and the weight of hungry seasons. Courts continue. Choirs continue, yet you feel a small looseness in the weave. Threads that once held fast begin to drift toward edges where wind can find them. Summer turns strange. The sun wears a thin veil, and fields do not sweeten as they should. Rains arrive and refuse to leave, or they never come at all. Grain rots in shock. People cut chaff into loaves. The smell of damp straw enters kitchens that once knew rye and honey. Along the roads, you meet men with hollow cheeks and women who hold quiet babies. In the night, the sky glows the way old men describe when they speak of distant mountains that send breath across oceans. Whether the fault lies in ash that rode the air from far away or in the sins named from pulpits, the barns do not argue. They stand empty. You pass checkpoints where officials count travelers with hard eyes. A decree fixes hands to soil and gives them fewer days to wander for better terms. The law intends order and finds sorrow. Estates tighten their grip. Villages barter for seed. The realm hears the click of locks where once there had been a hinge that allowed movement. You taste the dryness on your tongue and understand how easily complaint can turn to rumor and rumor to accusation. A voice appears on the southern roads, young, quick, convincing. He wears a name that belongs to a child who died with a small cry in a town beside a swift river. Some cradle songs still lean toward that child at dusk. The new voice says he never died at all. He tells of a rescue that hid him in a kindly house until he could grow strong and return. He speaks with the confidence of memory and the advantage of a new face. Nobles with careful smiles invite him to their tables. Priests test him with questions that touch the edge of doctrine. He answers with the ease of a student who has studied all night. Troops gather. Banners move. The city hears his footsteps without hearing his name. The throne changes owner again. A ruler who once steadied the realm falls on a hot day and leaves a silence in which a claimant enters and sits. Bells ring, some with joy, some with caution. There is a wedding with silk and foreign songs. Fireworks hiss above roofs and then fade into a sky that will receive any story. The court looks at the groom and sees grace, quick humor, promise. The court also looks at the groom and sees a stranger whose supporters wear uniforms that do not belong to these streets. The two visions never agree. At dawn, soldiers run through corridors. By noon, a body lies in a courtyard crowded with hearsay. A new oath is sworn by men who do not meet one another's eyes. You walk over ground that seems to split into twins. Outside the walls, another court rises in tents, a mirror with rough edges. A camp gathers near a village with muddy lanes and a name that comes easy to the mouth. Messengers carry orders from two capitals that face one another across a small distance. Each sure of its right, each hungry for the same granaries and the same prayers. Villages choose badly or choose well and find that the choice changes by week. Roads grow dangerous with riders who carry papers as sharp as knives. You climb a hill above a monastery that sits like a ship in a sea of dark verse. Stone walls hold within them a town of bells, kilns, barns, refectories, and a church where the scent of frankincense refuses to grow thin no matter how long the day lasts. An army rings these walls and expects surrender. Months pass. Monks mend breaches by lamplight. Peasants from nearby hamlets pass stones hand to hand in a line that continues after midnight. Icons dark with age gaze from porch and tower. Behind the iconostasis, a prayer that began before the siege began continues with the same pitch, the same modest volume, as if time could not reach it. When the ring finally breaks, the bells at the lavra speak with a relief that trembles and steadies at once. Autumn brings a step from the west that does not stop at the border. Nobles open gates and sign papers that promise order under a prince with a familiar title but a different tongue. A garrison enters the Kremlin with polished boots and their own chaplains. Markets go on. Weddings go on. Yet every hour has a second hand that points to the citadel and reminds the city who sleeps behind those walls. Houses keep candles ready and bundles by the door. The air tastes of smoke and cold iron. In another city that listens to two great rivers, a butcher who can count better than he can write stands on a crate and speaks to a crowd. His coat is plain. His voice is clean. He asks for money, grain, leather, courage. Beside him stands a wounded prince who leans on a staff and on the will of those who hear him. A small wooden church opens its doors. An icon that carries the tender face of a mother and child lifts from the altar and enters daylight. People kneel as it passes. The militia forms and begins its long walk. You walk with it. Frost rises white from fields. Villages offer bread and salt, then give more than they intended to give. The icon rides in the first rank. Words move through the ranks like warm breath. The city ahead tightens its belts and prepares to bleed. When the final street fighting ends, a flag that had no right to fly over these roofs comes down. Prisoners lay weapons on the steps of a church. The air holds the kind of quiet that follows the last note of a hymn. In that quiet, you feel relief, and you feel exhaustion, and you also feel a question that no one can ask aloud. How did it come to this? And will it come again? Snow covers the rubble and makes mercy of ugliness. In winter light, elders from towns and regiments and monasteries gather in halls where breath smokes above tables. They choose one name for a crown no longer steady. It belongs to a young man whose father knew the throne and whose family knew exile. He does not hurry to accept. He is found in a monastery where geese complain in a yard and the kitchen smells of cabbage and ash. The petitioners kneel. His mother, who wears a veil that hides grief and wisdom in equal measure, considers what the realm is asking of a son who has not yet grown used to a beard. Consent arrives slowly. When he finally rides toward the capital, people line the road with faces that look surprised by hope. You pass through streets that learn the weight of a new name. The two-headed bird returns to banners. Processions return to their measured routes. A wooden chapel rises near a corner of the square where the militia first gathered, and people bring small coins and larger promises for a stone church that will one day hold the memory of the icon that traveled with them. The realm exhales. Families rebuild ovens. Merchants unlock storerooms and test their scales with fruit and salt. A child laughs at pigeons that hunt crumbs by the cathedral steps. The laughter sounds louder than the pigeons. That is how you know the city lives again. Yet the years you have just walked do not fold neatly. The famine leaves a thinness in the faces of those who survived. The claimants leave stories that cannot agree. The child of Uglik still lies at the edge of memory, and the man who wore his name still rides the roads of rumor. Whether the sky dimmed because a far mountain sighed ash, or because hearts grew proud, the barns learned the same lesson. Whether rescue saved a prince or a clever wanderer learned the right answers, the square watched the same sunrise over the same scaffold. The tale will never choose for you. It sets choices on the table and steps back. You stand in the new ruler's first spring and listen to the river break its ice. The sound carries down streets and under bridges as if the city itself were a thawing instrument. People lift buckets, sweep thresholds, mend fences. The time of troubles teaches a habit of watchfulness and a tenderness for processions that travel with bread and candles rather than with drums. You close your eyes and breathe. The bells are not triumphant. They are steady. That steadiness will be needed for a long road ahead. You enter a winter morning that carries the weight of a coronation day. Frost paints the river like a quiet mirror. The city waits for a young ruler whose childhood has known too many locked doors and sudden silences. You move with the procession along narrow streets where fresh straw deadens the sound of hooves. The cathedral rises pale and sure, its domes gathering what the town cannot yet say aloud. Inside, candles lift their honeyed light. A crown waits on a cushion that breathes purple. A scepter rests beside an orb that reflects the nave in a trembling round world. The boy steps forward and the air tightens. A priest sets the crown upon his head and a title passes into him like a slow fire. Tsar. The word settles into stone, into banners, into every mouth that will speak power from this day. You feel the title change the room. A prince among princes becomes a sovereign who claims a realm that stretches beyond names. The choir's chant lengthens. People cross themselves in a single ripple that runs like wind through wheat. The new ruler receives the anointing oil and a cross that has traveled far from the city of emperors that once guarded the straits. The embrace of that memory gives him a frame made from older iron. You watch his eyes search the faces gathered under the vaults, nobles and clerics and servants, each measuring the shape of the years now beginning. Outside, snow gathers on the shoulders of statues. The square holds its breath and then releases it in relief and uncertain hope. You follow the days that come after the crown. Councils begin with early light. Decrees harden into clean sentences that carry through halls and over river ice. Messengers ride to towns that will learn a new rhythm. You watch how the title teaches the land to listen for a single voice. The court sets a calendar of judgments and blessings. A feast marks the season, yet the ruler eats as if the food were a duty, not a delight. Boyars bow with careful economy. Servants run the length of corridors that smell of wax and fur. A city that once negotiated with neighbors now gathers itself into a body that stands straighter. You ride east in spring as the sovereign turns his face toward a fortress that has long carried a different standard. The river unfurls like a steel ribbon under the sky. Banners fold and open above columns that move with patience rather than haste. You spend nights in camps where a small chapel of canvas glows with lamplight. Icons ride in carts, cushioned with cloth. The army arrives and lays a ring of wood and earth around high walls. Drums keep a heartbeat. The artillery speaks with a sound that walks across the ground and enters your bones. A gate buckles. A standard falls. You hear the city's name carried on the wind with awe and fear. Kazan opens to a new center. The victory shapes maps and confidence. It also reshapes prayers, since the faith of the conquerors and the faith of the conquered now share markets and alleys and the same winter river. The change asks merchants, judges, and priests to learn a wider grammar of the realm. You move south and feel the same long current draw the mouth of the Volga toward the crown. Astrakhan bends, and the river becomes a road that runs the empire into salt air. Fishermen mend their nets as new officials count the catch. The wind smells of reeds and brine. Caravans that once skirted the border now enter under banners they did not expect to salute. The ruler carries trophies home, not only in silver and silk, but in the knowledge that distance can be persuaded to kneel. The steppe listens and keeps its counsel. You return to the capital and enter a summer that grows too hot and dry. Smoke begins in a single quarter and runs like a bad dream through streets of wood. Fire takes roofs and leaps alleys. Bells ring from towers until ropes burn through and drop to stone. People run with buckets that make too small a difference. By night, the city is a crown of coals under a dome of sparks. The dawn reveals blackened beams and ash where houses once breathed. Accusations move like wasps. Grief finds a face and blames it. The ruler rides through ruins that smell of wet embers. He hears cries that are older than law. The city needs order and comfort in equal measure. You sit in a dark chamber where the sovereign shapes a thought that will ride out like a storm. He takes a portion of his realm for himself and gives it a name that sounds like a cord pulled tight. Men in black coats and capes appear with wolfhound eyes. Their saddles creak. Their whips hang like questions that never need to be asked. Villages feel hooves on frosted lanes at midnight, gates open to hands that carry seals and lists. The land learns a new way of listening, not to a law that speaks the same to many, but to a moving boundary that can step over a threshold and turn any house into a court. The aim of this creation remains a room with no windows. Some say it hunts treachery wherever it hides. Some say it feeds on fear and grows strong on the taste. The truth moves behind curtains and leaves only footprints. You walk through streets where heads turn toward the sound of bells, uncertain whether the tone means prayer or warning. The palace divides itself into quieter rooms. The former companions of childhood step carefully. A circular chapel fills with long services that soothe a mind that tries to hear certainty in the Psalms. You feel how that mind can carry tenderness for chant and fury for betrayal in the same hour. The servants learn to read the day by the weight of footsteps in the hall. You leave the city again and ride toward forests that hum with flies in high summer. Merchants of salt and fur gather in the houses of a wealthy family that holds lands near the Ural Mountains. They speak of a frontier full of silver streams and tall grass, of tribes who can read the steppe by the bend of a stalk, of a river that runs east and then north until it forgets where it began. The ruler grants letters that allow these merchants to raise a small army of free riders whose saddles are light and whose patience is long. Cossacks answer the call with weathered faces and easy laughter around the fire. A captain named Yermak shapes the river into a road and finds himself in a town whose timber walls look brave and thin under a wide sky. Battles happen in a noise of arrows and smoke. A cloak of snow settles over new forts that seem too far from everything to be possible. The frontier opens not all at once, but like a door that catches on the threshold and then swings free. You return to Moscow with this news riding ahead of you. The court hears of sable and pine, of copper and iron, of people with songs that hold the measure of winter. The realm grows in a way that a map can show with a line. Yet the real growth lies in the habit of sending orders into distances that once felt like myth. A scribe copies names that are not easy for his hand and smiles at the challenge. A bell rings in a small chapel beyond the Ural Ridge, and the sound loses itself in verse and the faintest echo answers from the mind of the capital. You feel time turn. The ruler grows older. Loss touches him in rooms hung with icons. A beloved dies. A city whispers. The hand that writes decrees tightens. The temper that once made plans now breaks like an oar against submerged rock. A blow falls where it should not. The sound of that mistake never leaves the corridors. The throne carries a sadness shaped like iron. You stand near the royal tombs and let the chill of the stones pass into you. The air smells of beeswax and cold limestone. You end the day under a sky washed clean by fresh snow. The city lies quiet. The title of Tsar remains on the cushion where it sleeps between ceremonies. Soldiers walk their rounds. Monks tuck their hands into sleeves and move along cloisters that know every season. The realm is larger than it was on the morning of the crown. It is also more frightened than it knows how to say. The road east now holds tracks that will deepen. The river south has learned the shape of new walls. In the hush, you sense how power can grow while a heart grows tight. The bells measure the hour. You breathe with them until the air feels gentle again, and the city returns to sleep. You wake beside a river that keeps pulling at the sea. Fog lifts from reeds and reveals piles of timber, masts like young trees, and men bending to planes and saws. A tall figure in a plain coat works among them with hands that smell of tar and spruce. The scrape of a blade and the tap of a mallet set the cadence. Skills gathered in foreign yards are now settled on this shore. The grand embassy has turned into wood and rope and habit. Keels set, ribs rise, planks drink pitch, and the water waits. You follow him to a city that is not yet a city. Islands and channels spread like lace, and the ground gives underfoot. Stakes sink. Stones pass hand to hand. A fortress climbs on a tongue of sand that points toward the Baltic. Peter and Paul look down from fresh ramparts as if guarding a newborn name. St. Petersburg enters speech in the spring of 1703 and sends its syllables across Europe like a bright coin. You walk first streets and feel the difference. Nobles arrive by decree and bring architects who draw clean lines and wide prospects. Carriages splash where avenues will one day run straight as rulers. The Admiralty Yard lifts a spire that catches light and tells ships where the center lies. Orders call stone north so the capital can stand in brick and granite. The Neva receives load after load, and the banks harden. In 1712, the court moves, and the city learns to stand in winter without complaint. You enter a hall where scissors flash. Beards come away and fall into bowls. A small token stamped with a whiskered face rides in purses as proof that the tax has been met. Coats narrow, sleeves change. The court learns new steps. A clock chimes hours that match Amsterdam and London. On the first day of 1700, the calendar shifts to years counted from a different origin. And the new year rises in winter light. You remember another shore in warmer light where reeds crowd a river mouth. Before the Baltic lessons, he turned south and built boats on the Don. At Voronezh, he walked slips laid in clay and watched carpenters lash frames for a fleet that would face the fortress of Azov. Oars bit water, sails filled, and in 1696, the mouth opened to his flag. A navy was no longer an idea after that day. It was a ledger, a dock, a keel underfoot. On the road home, he found revolt among the Streltsy. Gallows rose in squares, and the capital learned that order would keep hard company. The lesson stayed in corridors and followed him back to the river, where new masts climbed into a colder sky. You stand at Narva and taste snow that stings the tongue. Drums fade in wind. The early campaign stumbles, and the young army learns what seasoned troops can do. The lesson holds. Recruits drill until shoulders know the weight of muskets, as if they had been born with them. Iron and powder and patience gather. When the hour turns, you find yourself at Poltava in 1709. The ground trembles under volleys. Smoke lifts in sheets. The Swedish road bends away, and the realm begins to speak with a Baltic voice. You visit a foundry where cannon cool and a rope walk where strands twist into long cords that smell of hemp. In an office nearby, a clerk draws a chart that fixes service and rank in careful rows. The table of ranks will allow a man to rise by time and effort, not only by ancestry. The ink dries in 1722. Ambition finds a staircase with counted steps. Some tread lifts like promise. Some hide splinters. Both truths live in the same plank. You step into a print shop where letters sit in boxes like orderly seeds. A civil type replaces crowded curves with clean angles. Pages begin to look modern to eyes trained by an older hand. Books of arithmetic and engineering reach new schools. A teacher sets a compass on a slate and shows how circles answer rules that do not change with weather. Tea grows companionable in rooms where maps hang and ship models wait on shelves. You return to the Gulf where wind rings through rigging. Kronstadt braces the channel with stone and guns. Lighthouse beams search rain and fog. Sailors coil lines in the smell of pitch and wet wool. In 1721, trumpets salute a treaty that gives the realm a long cold window to the west. He accepts a new style and name. Emperor. The word does not yet fit easily in the mouth. It will. You enter a narrow room lit by a single window. A son kneels. A father watches. Between them lies a distance that neither can cross without injury. Words break before they arrive. Papers carry signatures that turn a family into a matter of state. The young man who once carried hope will die in 1718 within walls that outlive every voice raised inside them. Silence stays and does not explain itself. You walk embankments where crosses stand without names. Laborers rest with hands wrapped in cloth. Fever takes some and leaves others. A story grows that the city rose from marsh on bones. The numbers change from telling to telling. The wind cannot count them. Yet the carpenters point to cornices and say their fingers taught stone to look light. Sorrow and pride walk the same street. You pass a chapel where old believers shelter chants. The new city calls for new forms, yet the old thread holds. In a basement, a family keeps icons in their corner. On an upper floor, a salon reads French pages by candlelight. One stare binds the rooms. No decree can ask the heart to turn as quickly as the clock. Moscow hears all this and keeps its calm. Bells ring with a familiar tone. Markets go on. Couriers ride between two centers with packets tied in oilskin. Evening draws long over the Neva. The water turns copper and then black. The Admiralty spire fades to a thin memory of gold. The emperor walks a quay and stands with hands behind his back, thinking in rows and timetables and tide charts. You cannot know if the city he founded will shelter the soul he changed, or if the soul must learn a new room to survive. His coat lifts in the wind. He turns and goes inside. You wake to frost that looks like breath laid upon the earth. The river under you hardens in long glassy lanes and turns into a road. Sled runners whisper. The morning carries the smell of birch smoke and wet leather. You travel with riders who sit easy in saddles and who read the sky the way others read lines of a book. They tie bells to reins so that the teams will hear one another in white weather. You cross a gate of timber and earth called an ostrog and see watchtowers lean over the track like guardians. Inside, a small chapel warms slowly. A storehouse breathes tar and grain, and a clerk writes names that were new to his ear last winter and are now familiar to his hand. You move with these men as they gather fur tribute that rustles in sacks and glows in lamplight. The word yasak fills the pages of ledgers. It moves through glades of larch and climbs low passes that smell of stone. In villages of conical lodges, you watch a reindeer herd settle under the touch of a herder who knows each animal by the sound of its bell. A drum carried by a shaman sleeps under a skin cover. When it wakes, its steady pulse calls stories into one room. You listen with your eyes closed and feel the lidless attention of winter around the walls. You reach a palisade that sits above a bend of a river that keeps its name even when snow claims the shore. A wooden cross stands near the gate. Yakutsk settles into your memory. It is a place of loaded boats in thaw and of caravans in freeze. Traders carry iron kettles and bead strings, linen and knives. They leave with soft heaps of sable and fox. Priests bless the deals and the departures. A child watches the river and waits for the first sound of oars under ice each spring. You hear the oars before you see them. You push north until the sun turns into a coin that hangs low and cold. At the mouth of a great river, you find huts half buried against the wind. Nets freeze stiff in loops. Men with faces burned pale by reflected glare tell of a coast that continues long beyond the map. In summer, skin boats skip from inlet to inlet. In winter, sleds carry meat and news along the shore. You taste the salt that always lives in the air near ice. You sleep in a house where a tunnel leads from snow to room and where warmth rests like a living creature at the center of the floor. You move east along a rim of continent that seems to hide its end. Stories keep pace with you. Some tell of a captain named Desnyov who ran beyond the far horn where the land falls away and the sea turns a different color. They say his boats shattered and his men walked for months along a coast that had no map. The reports lie folded in chests for years and then rise again in a later century. You cannot be sure of the exact line of his voyage. You accept that a man may have rounded the last cape before anyone knew how to praise him for it. You come at last to a harbor that looks like a hand cupped against the wind. The name Okhotsk fits the mouth of the river like a cork. The air smells of kelp and cold fish. Ships gather here in seasons when storms are kind. They carry mail, flour, rope, and the nervous hope of men who intend to follow currents toward a thought they will later call Alaska. You watch crews mend sails with needles big as fingers. A priest walks the strand with a book held close to his chest to keep the spray from its pages. He blesses a mast and moves on without haste. You follow a road that is less a road than a promise. It climbs larches, crosses bogs on corduroy logs, descends to the sea, and leaps a narrow strait in the mind before anyone has seen the opposite shore. You enter a cabin on the Kamchatka Peninsula where maps lie weighted with stones and a small stove wrestles with damp wood. A Dane in imperial service sets a finger on a chart and speaks in Russian learned by patience. Vitus Bering looks to the north where the sea narrows. In 1728, he will guide a vessel into a channel that separates continent from continent and return with a truth that changes the line of the world. Years later, another voyage in 1741 will lift ashore from fog and show dark forests and high mountains on a coast that will one day know a different flag. You walk markets that fill with pelts heaped like snowdrifts and with men who have learned to live by the catch. Promyshleniki finger the fur with the care of musicians handling strings. They pack it into barrels for the long portage back to the capital. In their talk, you hear words borrowed from many tongues. You hear the names of islands with rookery cliffs. You hear the names of rivers where fish run so thick a spear finds its target without aim. You hear the names of storms that can teach a ship humility. They cross themselves when they say those names, and then they laugh because they will sail anyway. You turn inland again to a town that grew from a treaty signed far away. Kyakhta sits on a windswept steppe where tea bricks stack like dull green bricks of treasure. Traders weigh silk. Officials stamp the papers that keep peace along a long border. Samovars bubble in houses lined with blue cloth. The scent of tea will travel all the way to winter rooms in capitals and monasteries. Cups knock softly on saucers. Conversation slows to match the rhythm of steam that rises from the spout. You pass a column of prisoners walking in chains that do not rattle loudly because they are wrapped in cloth against the cold. They take long steps that settle into a march which seems to belong to the land. A guard carries a sacred image in a box that opens for prayer at dusk. Exile becomes a season in the life of the empire. Workshops gather near barracks. A forge rings. A school opens with a teacher who keeps warm by keeping boys at their letters. Punishment and settlement stand side by side in the snow and do not argue with one another. They simply exist. You wake to a thaw that frees rivers and turns every yard into shining mud. Boats slide from bank to current and vanish among willows. The province surprises you with gardens that bloom inside log frames. A woman sets out young cabbages while cranes step through a field that will harden again by October. You hear a singer in a language that holds a long tail inside the shape of a single vowel. The voice climbs and dips. It does not ask to be understood. It asks only to be heard. You sit with a scholar who keeps a cabinet of minerals. He sets a glinting shard into your palm and names the mountain that gave it. He draws a page from a folio and shows you a map that carries a perfect net of lines over a land where few roads exist. The names are careful. The rivers are true. The distances are guesses. The map will help the party to be less lost. He smiles and closes the cabinet with a key. You stand on a headland at dusk and look across water toward a line that may be cloud or coast. The wind lifts your coat. The waves keep their private counsel. Behind you lies an empire that has learned how to move grain to a famine town by sled in February. Ahead of you lies a route that will one day carry goods and grief by rail in 7 days. You let both truths rest together in your breath. You end the night in a chapel made from planks that still smell of sap. A small lamp gives a kind yellow light. Icons with northern faces gaze with quiet attention. A reindeer bell hangs by the door. You listen to the priest speak words as old as Rome in a voice shaped by the Lena and the Yenisei. Outside, the sky keeps its patient flame. You sleep with the certainty that horizons are not edges but invitations, and with the awareness that some first steps remain disputed, like tracks lightly written in spring snow. The land has decided to keep a few secrets, and you accept that as you close your eyes. You wake to the clatter of hooves in summer dust and the soft applause of silk in corridor light. A young empress moves with a measured step through rooms where mirrors hold her profile in a dozen frames. The crown sits easy on hair that pins itself in careful order. Perfume touches the air like ripe apricot. In letters, she signs Ekaterina and sends words across borders toward philosophers who smile at the speed of her pen. At home, she listens to clerks who lift tall stacks of reports and to officers who smell of horse and steel. You feel a dawning intention that asks the realm to look outward and inward at once. You cross the river to a palace where galleries are still learning how to breathe. Crates open. Paintings step into light. A small private museum grows in a side wing. This hermitage wears velvet on its walls and the sound of slippers on parquet. Portraits begin to populate the silence. A clock from the west spreads golden feathers and turns time into a peacock that wakes at the hour with a slow, bright shimmer. You stand close and hear the gentle click of hidden gears. The Empress likes machines that solve puzzles and rooms that display ideas. She also likes the quiet of a book laid flat on a table, a finger tracing a sentence written in a language new to the land. You sit among deputies summoned from towns and regiments and guilds. The Legislative Commission opens and mouths learn to shape words like equality before law and the dignity of persons. A guide text called the Nakaz lays pages on the lectern. It speaks of order without cruelty and of courts that answer reason. Quills rise and fall. The talk flows. The season changes. The commission will not write the code it was meant to write. Yet the room teaches men and women to hear themselves ask for justice. And the sound of that asking drifts back into provinces where it keeps warm in winter rooms. You ride south under vaults of blue where steppe grass ripples like the back of a sleeping animal. A commander with sharp eyes and a tenderness for theater invites you to see a future drawn on the open ground. Villages sit beside fresh roads. Orchards spread where surveyors laid strings. Carts carry grain toward rivers newly cleared of snags. People lift their caps when the Empress passes, and she sees order where another traveler might notice that paint dries too quickly in the sun. Stories argue later about how much of this view is preparation and how much is pretense. The memory refuses to settle into a single line. You feel both pride and performance in the same mile. You stand on a headland of the Black Sea where the wind tastes of salt and sage. An anchored flagship bows to the swell. Cannon speak in ceremonial salute. Far behind you lie campaigns that began with cold mornings and rain in the trenches, that marched through mud and summer glare, that crossed rivers with pontoon bridges set under arrowed clouds. The treaty at Küçük Kaynarca gives warm water a door and grants a voice for Orthodox souls beyond the frontier. Later, the Crimea enters the map with a signature and a blessing, and the blue line of coast begins to carry names that sound new to the tongue. A port called Sevastopol learns the smell of tar and pine. Another shore at Odessa hears the first hammers strike. A navy builds itself into the wave. You return inland to a land of river bends and wheat lights. Colonists come from many countries and bring bread strains and brick patterns and the custom of whitewashed walls. The map calls this region New Russia, and surveyors draft a future in straight lines. Cossacks move from old camps to the Kuban and learn a new river song. Monasteries bless the fields and the ferry crossings. Afternoon cicadas turn the heat into a hum that seems to support the sky. You step into a hall where nobles gather in satin and whisper around a paper with a golden seal. The charter to the nobility sets down privileges that had lived in custom and now live in law. The charter to the towns follows with guild boards and elected elders. Power arranges itself with the quiet of furniture put back after a long cleaning. The city burghers hold meetings with ink-stained hands. The aristocracy writes letters with scented wax. The crown breathes easier in the knowledge that order smiles from both sides of the street. You pass through villages where serfs count seasons with the same old sorrow. The borders grow. Estates grow. The tie between land and body tightens. In fields of rye, you hear songs that carry patience into twilight. A rumor walks the roads that one day freedom may come as a sunrise no one can miss. The same rumor turns heavy when a man on a white horse claims he is Peter returned and promises a world made new. Fires answer along the Volga. Forts burn. Pugachev rides across the south with banners that shine in dust. Regiments gather and clamp the lid down. When the lid cools, the Empress reads reports that smell of smoke and sweat. The promise of law continues, and the promise of release turns into a silence that waits. You enter a winter palace where chandeliers sing the cold into a rainbow of glass. Ambassadors bow. The Empress speaks of theater and science and the need for canals to carry grain to ports before the first frost. A courier arrives with neat news from the west. Borders have shifted. An old commonwealth is partitioned like a table set for too many guests. Maps receive new lines that run through farms and prayers. The realm widens again along rivers that have long flowed toward its speech. With the new land come new citizens who cross themselves in different ways and read their psalms in different letters. The court expects harmony by decree. Harmony instead learns by long conversation. You climb a staircase scented with wax and pine to a hermitage that is no longer small. Marble cools the hand. Greek and Roman forms talk softly in plaster. A violinist leans into a slow phrase in a side room and makes the corridor feel like water. The empress walks past canvases where light breaks over shoulders and plates where myth pours wine into days that never existed. She keeps some paintings private and some public, and by doing so, she teaches her court to think of beauty as a kind of citizenship. You travel the Dnieper among rapids that learn new names as engineers place soundings and set posts. Barges ride lower under heavier loads. At a river bend, an Italian architect in imperial service marks a site and sets a plan for streets that will welcome wind from the sea. The town that grows here will send wheat and stories outward for 2 centuries. An old Cossack church watches the first stones laid and wonders in its silence how the tune will change. You walk through a study where the desk holds a half-written letter to a French friend. The tone is easy. The ideas are large. Somewhere in the same room, a sealed report waits from a province where a jail has grown crowded and a judge asks for guidance. The balance between image and burden forms an invisible scale that never stops trembling. No one can be sure whether she truly planned to loosen the bonds of the peasantry or whether she only placed the thought at the edge of the blotter to keep courage nearby. The doubt remains like a bookmark that never falls out. You join an autumn journey south where the sky stretches and does not let go. Crowds gather on the roadside with baskets of grapes and salt. Triumphal arches rise beside fields. The empress rides under them and smiles. In the distance, bays shine and ship masts push along the line of the horizon. A saint's icon rides in a carriage ahead and its glass winks at sun. Courts will later tell 2 different tales about this progress. One tale praises planning that lifts new life out of open steppe. The other tale insists on backdrops moved from village to village. You stand between versions and feel both the sincerity of hope and the care of arrangement. You end the day in a chapel where the chant warms stone in early evening. The double-headed bird looks down from the vault, one face toward the Baltic and one toward the Black Sea. Candles burn with steady light. A young officer kneels and prays before leaving for a distant garrison. A widow lights a thin taper for a son lost to fever in a shipyard. The city outside turns its lamps on the embankments and listens to ice begin to form along the river edges. In this glow, you understand how splendor and strain are woven into the same fabric, and how the season of Catherine leaves a sheen on the cloth that will not fade. You walk the last corridor of night and pause at a window that looks over gardens made geometric by frost. The empire holds new ports and new galleries, new charters and old burdens. It speaks French in salons and the old tongue in kitchens. It keeps a peacock clock that opens its wonder once per day, and it keeps barns where wheat is measured by hand. The rooms are bright. The roads are long. You stand in the stillness and listen to the palace breathe. Somewhere a pen scratches. Somewhere a watchman stamps his feet for warmth. The hour passes, and the river carries the sound away. You wake to a river that glides east in summer light and hear boots on the western bank where a vast host folds into columns. Standards lift. Drums pull breath into a single rhythm. The day is June and the year is 1812. You stand on the Russian side of the Niemen and feel the ground hum as an army crosses with confidence learned during a decade of victories. The river accepts them without comment and moves on, the way water accepts any story and carries it away. You ride inland along roads that darken with dust. Villages pull their shutters tight. Wheat bends. The air smells of rye and sun-warmed rope. Behind you, stores go to the torch so that granaries will not feed strangers. A line of prisoners shuffles toward the rear, and another line of recruits moves forward with faces that look older at dusk than they did at dawn. You hear officers speak of drawing the enemy deeper, of letting distance thin pride. It is not an easy choice. It is the choice made. You enter Smolensk under smoke that curls from scorched beams. Bells that once called markets now call regiments. The walls hold for a hard hour. Then the army withdraws along the high road where birches make a pale colonnade. You watch carts creak with icons and cradle blankets. You listen for the voices of families that refuse to break, and you hear them in the way a mother tucks a ladle into her bundle, because even flight needs a kitchen at the end of the road. You stand at a field that will later carry a single name through centuries. The ground near Borodino breathes fog in early morning. Batteries sit like dark islands. Lines form and straighten. You feel the steadiness of Kutuzov settle over the army. The day breaks, and the air fills with grape and canister and the heavy step of men who walk into sound. The field heaves until evening. When silence returns, it carries the weight of a draw that tastes like a wound for both sides. The army remains a living thing. The road behind it remains open. You approach Moscow with tired hooves and a sky the color of pewter. Gates open, then close, then open again as commanders measure what ritual cannot change. The army withdraws through the city like a river that must reach another basin. Icons leave with it. Families bury small treasures beneath hearths, kiss thresholds, and step away. You stand in a lane that knows every season and feel the emptying of a capital that has decided to protect the realm by surrendering its own pride. You enter Moscow again at night and see fire climb into the dark like red trees. Roofs fall in bright sighs. Sparks ride wind along alleyways that once smelled of honey cakes and lamp oil. Warehouse windows glow white, then blacken. The storm of flame takes markets, churches, mansions, stables, and bathhouses, then leaps to the next street and the next. The city turns into a crown of embers that throws heat as far as the river bends. The cause keeps its mask. Some point to saboteurs who stayed behind with flint and tinder. Some point to accidents born of soldiers and open hearths and wind that changed its mind. The result is certain. The reason remains a room with the door half closed. You walk those streets when ash lifts underfoot like gray breath. A conqueror enters a palace that cannot feed him. He stares at halls where mirrors look back with cold faces. A samovar rescued from a cupboard warms one circle of officers, yet the city around them refuses to serve. The countryside holds back. The markets are gone. The barns are empty. You feel the quiet of a plan that has no document and yet writes on every wall. Stay, and hunger will govern. Leave, and winter will speak. You stand with the army as it turns its face east, then north, then west, using roads that know the shape of winter. Frost begins in grass at dawn. By noon it melts, and by evening it returns with a harder edge. The first snow arrives soft as wool and hides ruts that break ankles. Cossack riders drift along the flanks like wind-blown crows and strike when wagons falter. Peasant partisans close lanes with felled trees and vanish into pine. You hear the song of a sled bell, and then you hear only the cold. You reach a river that folds and bends through willow islands. The Berezina runs black under ice skin and carries planks and bodies together toward the low sun. Bridge builders work with numb hands while guns speak from both banks. Columns push across. The water accepts those who cannot keep their footing. The far shore fills with men who walk and do not look back. You step aside and let them pass. Their silence explains more than any report. You move with Russian camps that smell of smoke, horse, and leather. Tents glow like coals. A priest lifts an icon of the Mother of God of Kazan, and the canvas holds its breath while he speaks the same old words in a voice shaped by frost. A lad rubs his hands to bring life to fingers that will wrap a musket at dawn. In one corner of the fire circle, an old soldier tells a simple story. He says that victory often feels like waking to another march, another guard shift, another bowl of buckwheat that tastes of iron pot and gratitude. You follow the retreating road into lands that once listened to trumpets and now listen to hunger. The line thins, boots fail, flags lower. A hat with a cockade lies in the ditch and freezes there. You walk past it and keep walking because winter insists on forward motion. Crows shoulder the air. Pines creak. The enemy that entered with fanfare leaves with a sound like cloth rubbed between tired hands. You lift your eyes from snow and see another season ahead. Summer brings fresh regiments moving west. The year turns to 1813, and the ground near Leipzig shakes under the step of Allied armies. The great battle ends, and a door opens toward the heart of Europe. You stand in streets far from home and watch uniforms of many colors ride together beneath cold sun. A year later, you see domes and stone bridges that once belonged to Rome and now belong to Paris. A Russian camp settles in the city that had offered the world a new calendar and a new code. Horses drink from troughs where statues look down with indifferent eyes. The river under those bridges keeps its old name and ignores all uniforms. You enter a hall where maps lie under glass paperweights, and men in coats cut from perfect cloth speak of borders as if they were rivers that could be moved by thought alone. The Congress of Vienna shapes a long peace with careful hands. The realm receives a kingdom that bears the old name Poland, and that bows to a czar as king. Court language grows more complex. Duties grow heavier. The map looks tidy under candles. You listen for the footsteps outside the hall, steps of people who will live under the lines the candles created. You pause to notice the smaller currents that ran while armies marched. A woman keeps an icon corner bright in a wooden house near Tver, while her husband serves in a militia that never reached the frontier. A child in a kokoshnik shelling peas by the stove learns a rhyme about winter that will outlast her own breath. A troika carries a bride under bells that speak silver over the road. Culture continues in kitchens and barns. It also continues in salons where a poet drafts a stanza that carries ash and frost into vowels that glow like embers. The realm survives by living its ordinary day. You let a last uncertainty linger. Historians bring pages and opinions to the fire, yet the root of Moscow's burning remains elusive. The decision to abandon the old capital to save the army carries a plain logic, yet the feeling inside that choice resists language. Whether the winter itself acted as ally or whether supply lines and stubborn villages broke the invader more completely, the season accepts no praise. It simply exists. You keep the questions nearby, not as thorns, but as reminders that victory often rises from patience that refuses to announce itself. Night closes over a camp that no longer fears the next trumpet. Snow softens the churned earth. The samovar hums in a circle of quiet men. A hymn moves through the lines in a tone worn smooth by 1,000 services. You breathe with it. The wind carries the last sparks upward. Far away, bells in Moscow ring over blackened streets where scaffolds hold new beams and ovens warm again. The land has learned to absorb fire and return bread. You listen to that lesson until sleep arrives like a blanket settled by a careful hand. You wake to streets that remember triumph and prefer quiet. The army has returned, and the realm smooths its uniform and closes its ranks. In palaces near the Neva, chandeliers repeat their stars in marble. In barracks on the outskirts, boots line up under bunks. Alexander rules with a mind that carries both victory and wariness. He signs papers for a holy alliance that wraps monarchs in the language of Christian concord. He also reads devotional pages alone at night, while a lamplight stains the paper amber. In these rooms, the air smells of wax and roses. In other rooms, it smells of ink and drill. You walk the embankments and see a bronze rider rear against the sky. The horse's copper veins catch winter sun. Peter's cloak turns the wind into a visible shape. The city takes strength from that figure, and also a shiver. The statue watches a new century wrestle with its old duty. Young officers pause under the horse's lifted forelegs and dream of order learned from Europe and dignity granted to the people who fill the squares at noon. They meet in apartments where the tea cools before talk cools. A piano lid gleams. Pages pass from hand to hand with careful restraint. Words like oath and charter and law begin to sound like tools rather than ornaments. You sit in a salon where women hold the room together with tact and fire. The talk moves from French verses to Russian rhythms that have begun to find their own gait. A poem lies on a side table in a neat hand that belongs to a young man with wild charm and a talent for rhyme. Pushkin's syllables fold snow, smoke, bells, and youthful pride into a music that knows both street and meadow. He writes of liberty in a tone that keeps step with hearts that hunger for it. The city learns to listen to poets with a new seriousness. The loose gatherings take on the mood of small parliaments seated on cushions. You cross a courtyard and enter a lodge lit by candles in iron rings. The men remove gloves and speak plainly. They carry names from different provinces and regiments, and yet they call one another brothers for the length of the meeting. The union of salvation gives way to the union of welfare. The Northern Society writes in firm sentences. The Southern Society writes with a harder edge. Some favor a constitutional throne. Some speak of a republic that will begin like a clean snow. They agree more easily on what must end. They use the word serfdom and pronounce it like a wound that needs stitching. They swear to work toward law that treats the peasant as a man with standing. Once the candles are out, they pass through the smell of cold iron and stable straw to separate lodgings, still part of a single thought. You ride to provinces where the calendar seems slower. Fields lie under frost, village bells hang silent from wooden frames. Estate houses glow in one or two windows only, since candles must be counted. The steward reads lists of dues. Men step forward with caps in hand. Women stand near ovens with cheeks warmed by fire and eyes cooled by winter. You feel how the old tie between land and body continues to hold with quiet strength. The snow records boot prints, and the weight of the system sits in every mark. A traveler can feel the friction under each step. You stand at church on a feast day when snow drifts against the porch and the nave glows blue with smoke. The priest swings a censer, and the choir climbs a fifth that makes the ceiling seem higher. The emperor kneels with a humility that is both natural and trained. He rises and walks past faces that look toward him with reverence that contains a plea. He hears the plea and cannot solve it in a single winter. He sends inspectors. He orders better schools for officers. He writes to governors and asks them to look after roads with more care. He continues to pray more often than he used to. He travels south to a port where pines lean toward a gentle sea. He falls ill in a house filled with mild light and dies quietly in the year 1825. You wait with courtiers who do not know which door to open. The next heir has already renounced his right and serves in a distant capital. Papers exist that explain the path of succession. They have not been read aloud. Messages ride and return. In the streets, troops and officials lift oaths to one name and then to another. The air grows brittle with hesitation. In that pause, plans written in the careful ink of the Northern Society find their hour. You stand in a square that opens toward the river and toward history. Snow lies fresh and bright. The cold makes every sound clear. Columns of young officers and soldiers take position before the Senate building. They form around a banner that says they want law that speaks for all and a throne that answers to its own signature. The statue of Peter turns a dark profile to the scene as if measuring the moment. The new Tsar rides elsewhere under a sky just as cold and takes his oath in a separate ceremony. The city holds two truths in the same morning. You feel hope tremble and harden. The men in the square wait for allies who hesitate. Hours pass and lines stiffen without growing. Church bells ring a feast day and add a note of uneasy grace to the air. Envoys try words first and fail to bend the circle. Cannon arrive, heavy and patient. The sun drops toward the river and turns the frost into a soft fire. The order to clear the square leaves a silence in its wake, and then a concussion that moves through coat and bone. Grapeshot sweeps lanes in the ranks. The banner falls. Boots slip on ice and catch again. The square empties with a speed that does not feel like running. It feels like history reclaiming the street for ordinary time. You walk the embankment that night. The river smokes in the cold. Windows show long tables where ministers confer by candle. Arrests follow routes that were drawn by the meetings of the past year. The city sleeps while sleds carry men to cells with narrow windows. Trials begin and sentences hold years like stones. Swinging boards rise at a fortress and drop. Exiles take the road to Siberia with wives who have decided to share the march. The empire hardens its face and rehearses a new habit of vigilance. A pen in the palace writes laws to restrain speech and press. Rooms that once held debate become quiet. You pass through barracks where veterans of the Great War sit with their thoughts. Some wonder why the youth spoke in such quick voices. Some wonder why the men of office could not hear those voices earlier. None of them say these things aloud. They drink tea and mend gloves and teach recruits to stack arms with precision. A prayer runs along the bunks in low tones. The realm chooses order over argument and does not apologize for the choice. You open a volume in a study where the stove ticks as it cools. On the first page is a plan for gradual emancipation that never escaped the desk where it was drawn. The handwriting is neat. The margins show revisions. The author slept poorly and then died in a far town by the sea. The paper remains, and those who discover it later feel a mixture of relief and regret. Relief that a ruler could conceive a gentler future. Regret that the thought stopped at the edge of a blotter and did not become a decree. The mystery of his final months stays with the land like a veil that never lifts. Some think he wished to leave the world and live among strangers in a monastic quiet. Some think illness was all that moved him. The sea knows and keeps the answer. You end the night under the gaze of the bronze rider. Stars prick the black above the spire of the Admiralty. Snow hushes the street. The city that once burned to save the army now stands as a guardian of silence. In that silence grows a poetry that will soon turn sorrow and iron into lines that glow. In that silence grows a new reign that believes in drill and in charts and in the stern logic of files. The square where youth raised its voice becomes a lesson taught in whispers. You breathe the cold and listen for the faint rasp of the river breaking ice far downstream. The realm has turned inward to gather strength. It has also planted questions that will not die. You carry both sensations as you close your eyes. You wake to corridors where uniforms soften their footfalls and files rise like small walls of paper. The new ruler walks with a measured step that makes courtiers straighten as he passes. Nicholas carries order in his shoulders and suspicion in his eyes. He believes in a trinity he can speak in one breath: orthodoxy, autocracy, and the idea of a national spirit that binds field and palace. The throne tightens its belt. A new office watches letters, salons, and streets. The empire learns a habit of reporting that turns rumor into work for clerks. You step into a room where a minister lays a ruler across a map and draws a line between the capitals. Engineers follow with levels and stakes. Forests open, swamps are tamed, and embankments rise in steady lifts of earth. In 1851, the first train runs between St. Petersburg and Moscow, iron wheels finding a rhythm that will change distances forever. People gather to watch the locomotive breathe steam like a beast brought to heel. The whistle cuts the air. Peasants cross themselves with curiosity and fear. A new sound enters village memory, a sound that promises speed and threatens quiet in the same hour. You pass a table where censors read with faces that reveal nothing. Pages lose a sentence, then a line, then a whole paragraph, and the white spaces look like winter fields. Writers answer by threading their meanings under coats of wit and sorrow. A young poet lies in a snowy dueling ground in 1837, and the city walks softly for a week as if the streets themselves could bruise. Another poet falls in the Caucasus 4 years later with mountain light in his last glance. Their lines move into memory and make a lamp for readers who must walk by feel. You travel to the Caucasus and stand on a ridge where wind tastes of stone and thyme. A fortress sits above a river that speaks in rapids. Horsemen in felt coats ride along terraces that climb towards snow. The war here stretches across decades like a rope pulled tight. Villages descend into the valley with cattle and icons when patrols approach. A prayer to a mountain saint answers a prayer to an Eastern prophet across a ridge. Officers write sketches in notebooks at night. A young count who will one day write a long book about other wars learns the weight of a half-truth and the value of a clean sentence in these camps. You move north to a city that wears rumor like a thin shawl. The year is 1830, and a kingdom joined by the decisions of Vienna rings with church bells that call not to feast, but to gather. Cadets fire at commands they refuse. Streets fill. The struggle burns bright and then dims under weight of numbers, yet the memory refuses to die. The empire answers with new rules, new schools, new men at desks. The language of the capital steps into classrooms where another language once led the lesson, and children learn new terms for old grief. You sit with men who drink tea from glasses held in metal holders and argue carefully about the soul of the nation. One group loves the West for its science and law, its parliaments, its learned calm. Another group loves the village for its communal bench and old prayers, its humility and songs. They choose the names Westernizer and Slavophile, and then continue to borrow ideas from each other without admitting it. In the corner of the room, a samovar hums like a good mood, and a bowl of cherry jam glows. The talk ends without victory, because the argument names a living tension that no verdict can close. You walk factory yards where hammers ring and smoke climbs. New mills begin to turn, and towns that once slept after dusk now glow in windows while spindles hum. Workers leave fields season by season and learn to measure time by whistle and shift. The peasant commune still claims their roots. The foreman counts their hours. The contradiction settles into bodies that ache and dream of land held free. In winter barracks, A young man who has read banned pages tells a circle that the word serf should end. In a different room, a nobleman writes in his diary that the same word must end. Their sentences will not meet, and yet they will walk in step toward the same conclusion by roads that never cross. You stand before icons lit by thin candles in a small parish, where a priest speaks of obedience with a gentleness that makes the word sound less heavy. Weddings continue. Fast days continue. The habit of kneeling travels through generations with the same calm. Yet under the chant you feel a low murmur, the complaint of a system that keeps people tied to soil when money, machines, and trains ask them to move. The pressure waits like spring flood behind ice. You ride south along a coast where ancient ruins look down on modern cannon. The year is 1853, and the Black Sea glitters. Diplomacy has frayed. An empire to the south claims a caliph's legacy and controls holy places that call to distant powers. When talks fail, fire touches the water. Fleets wake. The great game of alliances gathers Britain and France to one side, the empire on the step to the other. You hear the rattle of chains in ports and the measured tread of marines on decks. A telegraph key taps news across wires that did not exist in earlier wars. The modern world enters the campaign like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. You enter Sevastopol as earthworks rise and ships scuttle themselves to block a harbor mouth. Guns move into bastions that take names from captains who stand there with calm that will outlive them. The siege begins, and the city learns to breathe in the rhythm of bombardment and repair. Women carry water and bandages. Priests move among the trenches with words that lift and steady. In night silence, you hear the scratch of pens as young officers write pages that will become the truest record of this grim school. You walk the heights of Inkerman, where fog lies thick enough to turn the morning into a blindfold. Lines stumble into one another and fight at touch and breath. Courage does all it can. Confusion does more. You ride along the ravines of Balaclava and feel the ground tremble under horses that run where they should not. The valley takes them and gives back silence. Far away, a nurse from Britain carries a lamp along rows of cots and teaches a science of care that will change wars. On both sides, bravery wastes itself against poor logistics and old routine. The lesson grows like frost on the inside of a window. It is easy to see and hard to wipe away. You enter field hospitals where surgeons work with clean hands when they can and with clean intentions when they cannot. Supplies arrive late and in wrong amounts. Boots fail. Rifles and shells from industrial foundries reach the enemy with a speed the empire cannot match. Reports climb to the palace, and the ink itself looks tired. The city under siege holds for a long year. When the south side finally falls, it falls into the arms of men who have given the last of their strength to a line that no longer holds. The North Bank still raises a flag because some symbols insist standing even when the ground trembles. You return to the capital in winter and see faces change color as the news reaches officials. A court built on steadiness meets a storm built on invention. The old network of ministries feels like furniture that cannot be moved through a new doorway. The Tsar grows quiet and carries the defeat like a private weight. He steps into the last illness with the dignity of a soldier who never left parade rest. In 1855, he hands the realm to his son and leaves his final thought in the air like a breath on glass. Reform is no longer a thought for speeches. It has become a requirement the size of a continent. You sit by a stove with men who will count the cost. They speak in soft voices about railways, schools for engineers, fairer courts, and a word that must finally change its meaning. Serf cannot remain a legal fact while factories and regiments expect initiative. The council does not declare the future in one night. It places stones in a path that will lead toward it. Outside, snow falls without hurry. The bells of St. Isaac's answer the hour with a tone that carries both grief and promise. You let one doubt stay near the light. Some pages hint that Nicholas kept a plan for a slow easing of bondage that he never dared to sign. Others say he could not imagine the village without the chain that attached it to the estate, and that he never tried to imagine it. The papers do not agree. The heirs will act. The argument about the father's intent will remain a corridor where scholars still walk with lamps. You end the section on a quay where the Neva turns black under late sky. Ice collars the piles. The Admiralty spire holds a small star at its tip. A sentry stamps his feet, and breath makes a cloud. You look across the river toward a city that learned poetry under watchmen and science under siege. The war has washed pride in cold water and left it cleaner. The empire stands at the edge of change. You listen to the low rumble of a distant train, and the rails carry the sound into the dark like a promise that wears iron shoes. You wake to a winter morning that feels like a ledger open to a clean page. Snow hushes the streets. Sentries stamp their feet on granite steps. A young emperor sits with ministers who carry maps, statistics, and a quiet urgency that came home from Crimea. You hear the sentence spoken with a clarity that cuts the room. It is better to end bondage from above than to wait for it to burst from below. The words do not warm the air. They begin to warm the future. You stand in a council chamber where ink thickens in wells and drafts multiply. Landowners argue over allotments and payments. Advocates for the village speak of dignity measured in acres and time. The document grows through winter after winter until it can live on its own. In the year 1861, on a day when wind trims the flags along the embankment, the Emancipation Statute receives the seal. Bells answer with a tone that sounds both relieved and uncertain. Peasants become subjects with rights to marry, to transact, to stand in courts under their own names. The land comes with redemption payments that stretch into decades. In a cottage where icons glow, a family studies the new terms under lamplight that smells of flax. The father thinks of his sons and of fields that will no longer be someone else's command. The mother thinks of a wedding that may come without permission. The children hear only the bell and remember the sound for the rest of their days. You follow the first spring of freedom into muddy lanes. Village assemblies select elders and measure strips with ropes knotted at the old intervals. A clerk reads aloud from a copy of the statute and taps the margin with a careful finger. The commune keeps its bench beneath a birch. The habit of cooperation stays. The habit of obligation changes shape. You watch a boy who can now choose service in a factory or a regiment without a landlord's letter. He lifts his cap to the priest at the gate and walks on with steps that learn a new rhythm. You enter a courtroom where the air feels clear. New statutes of 1864 have raised a bench that stands straight and tall. Juries listen to advocates whose words run like clean water. Judges wear a seriousness that comes from independence. Reporters take notes and teach the public to care about verdicts. A clerk files a petition that does not require a bow. A widow hears her case spoken in phrases she can follow. The law begins to speak in a voice that people can recognize as their own. You ride along a road where the Zemstvo meets inside a whitewashed hall. Coats hang on pegs that once held harness. Doctors present numbers for clinics that serve 3 districts instead of 1. Teachers ask for primers and chalk. Surveyors propose culverts that will keep spring floods from swallowing bridges. A landowner who loves music donates a piano to a school and smiles when children crowd the keys after the lesson. An elder from a distant hamlet brings a basket of apples as payment for the vaccination of a granddaughter. Local self-government teaches the empire how to hold itself together through useful talk. You visit a barracks where conscripts stand at ease and look younger than their boots. The year is 1874, and a law sets service in terms that almost anyone can accept. The old lottery of lifetime duty becomes a brief season with time for schools under arms. The drill yard breathes more evenly. A peasant learns letters from a sergeant who loves grammar. A merchant's son learns to share a blanket with a shepherd. The army begins to look like the country that feeds it. You step into a station where steam stains the roof beams and a telegraph needle clicks like a nervous bird. Cars fill with sacks of rye and with families that bring quilts and bread knives. The rails multiply across Black Earth and Tega. Moscow touches Nizhny Novgorod in a night instead of a week. The Ural passes iron to foundries without mud. Odessa opens its doors to barges that have ridden rivers marked by soundings and lights. The nation becomes a map that obeys a timetable. A samovar hisses in a third-class car while a mother tells her child to watch for the milestone with a white cap. The milestone appears on schedule. The boy laughs as if time has learned to keep promises. You move to the west, where a kingdom with an old crown takes up arms in winter woods. The year is 1863, and the January uprising whispers through forests and cities. You hear hymns in churches that carry a grief older than any edict. Insurgents raise banners that shine briefly at dusk. Columns pursue them along tracks that deaden under snow. The struggle ends with courts and exile. Schools receive new rules. A language retreats from public rooms and stays in kitchens and chapels. The empire tightens, then equips the region with rail and office, both efficient and cold. You travel south to Caucasian valleys where streams leap in sunlight. A long war finishes at last. In the year 1864, mountain fighters descend to treaties and migrations. Forts fold into towns that will one day know theaters and parks. A coronet of stone churches and mosques shines after rain. The wounds of that long struggle do not close quickly. They remain in songs that carry memory beyond the reach of proclamations. You ride beyond the steppe into a city where blue tiles recall older empires. The general governor spreads a map that reads Turkestan across the center. Tashkent comes under imperial coat in 1865. Samarkand follows with its domes and madrasas bright as a dream. Khiva yields in 1873. Kokand enters the fold 3 years later. The story written in dispatches speaks of trade routes opened and law extended. The story spoken under grape arbors speaks of tribute and rule arriving with drill and surveyor's chain. Between the two versions stands the bazaar, where tea steams and carpets glow and voices adjust to the new scale of the world. You sail a cold sea where the horizon sits close and blue. A treaty writes the year 1867 at the bottom of a ledger, and Alaska changes hands in quiet rooms. The price looks small to later eyes. In the moment, it looks like prudence. A coastal chapel keeps its candles bright and speaks the same prayers after the flag changes above the fort. The wind climbs the mast and ignores all paperwork. You step back into the capital for a winter that shivers with political melody. A composer brings a ballet to the stage and fills it with snow that falls from a painted sky. A novelist sits over proofs that describe a house of charity where faith and suffering share the same bed. Another novelist drafts a scene from a provincial estate where conscience meets consequence over tea. You hear Tchaikovsky's violins lift a sadness that feels tender rather than bitter. You hear Tolstoy's pages turn like slow breath. You hear Dostoevsky's lines ring like iron struck in a cellar and then warmed by candlelight. The city learns to listen for the soul as if it were an instrument tuned by hardship and hope. You follow a rumor that becomes a movement. Students carry books into villages and try to teach letters to men who know weather better than grammar. The villagers thank them and return to scythes and ovens. Some students grow impatient with gratitude that never votes. Cells form and whisper. A new phrase enters the street. The will of the people means to bend history with sharp hands. Bombs test the theory. Police files thicken. Informers and idealists share taverns without knowing it. The emperor gives a constitution almost to his fingertips, and then leaves the document on the table for the morning. You walk beside the Catherine Canal on a cold day when the ice looks sound. A carriage rolls. A figure steps toward it with the calm of a man who has practiced for a year. The blast breaks glass along the embankment and drives a silence into the crowd. The emperor still stands. He approaches the attacker with the pity of a soldier who knows injury. A second blast carries the day into darkness. The Church of the Savior on spilled blood will rise over this place with mosaics that burn like daylight trapped in stone. In that church, an empire will kneel and remember the moment when hope for slow reform met a faster hand. You let one uncertainty remain in the room. The act of emancipation reads like courage on paper, and like compromise in the fields where allotments stinted and payments lingered. The last hour of the emperor reads like fate to some, and like policy delayed too long to others. The truth refuses to choose. It lives in lives that grew wider after 1861, and in streets that narrowed in 1881. You keep both in mind as lamps bloom in windows across the capital. Night settles over the Neva with a steady blue. The embankments shine with frost. A train whistles far off and carries letters of a new century in its tender. In a village, a newly freed man closes his gate and thanks the saint whose icon looks down from a corner warmed by breath. In a mansion, a widow places a small portrait on a table and prays for a gentler hand on the scepter that remains. You listen to the city breathe through the hour. You feel the nation learning to move again, even in grief, along rails and roads and thoughts that cannot be stopped by winter. You wake to a map spread like cloth over a table and feel the edges pull outward. Telegraph keys tick in distant posts. Couriers change horses under skies that never end. The realm leans south and east at once and learns to breathe on two horizons. In oases where canals divide the sand into neat squares of life, the air smells of melon and dust. The general governor reads reports from Tashkent and Samarkand and sends back a tone that turns campaign into province. Markets under blue tiles hum afternoon prayers. A Russian officer orders tea and tries to write phrases in a notebook that carries words he barely understands. The letters look like small lamps on the page. You ride a line of rails that did not exist a few summers before. The Trans-Caspian route runs from the shore at Krasnovodsk through Merv toward the Oxus and beyond. The locomotive breathes in a dry wind. Engineers plant stakes across the Karakum as if drawing a staff across a drumskin to find pitch. Soldiers unload timber at stations made of sun-baked brick. Merchants step down with bolts of cloth and bundles of glossy fruit. In the next season, the same line carries regulations, inspectors, school primers, and the occasional violin case. Empires do not arrive in one day. They arrive by timetable and ledger book and a habit of morning roll call. You stand on the Pamir roof where air feels thin and near to light. Snow sits in hollows like folded silk. Guides move ahead with a calm that comes from knowing where stones lie under the drift. A post rises, white and red, and a second post stands a short walk away with a different crest. Agreements have drawn borders on peaks where only grass and ice ever felt at home. Below, valleys keep their own clocks. A shepherd lifts a hand and returns to his flock. Far offices argue over lines the sheep ignore. The great game lives here with a face that looks less like drama and more like a ledger of stages and mile markers. You travel north again and then outward along the great curve of Siberia. Cedars breathe resin. Rivers lie wide under summer and iron gray under ice. In 1891, a young heir plants a shovel in the earth at Vladivostok and names a promise. The Trans-Siberian Railway begins as a prayer for connection and a proof of will. Work gangs fell trees and sink pilings into swamps that swallow tools with a quiet gulp. Surveyors draw straightness across a land that prefers long curves. Bridges rise and trains inch east with freight cars full of bricks, flour, coal, and a new confidence made of pine and steel. You enter Vladivostok at dawn, while gulls stitch white cloth across the bay. The air tastes of salt and coal smoke. Nets dry on racks beside a chapel with a blue onion dome. A bell rings with a tone that sounds surprised and pleased to echo off hills that slope like sleeping animals. Sailors carry rope to the quay where ships with sharp bows rock against pilings. A carpenter lifts a plank and reveals a small icon hidden under shavings. He touches the wood and smiles without speaking. On the horizon, a fog bank hides a border that exists only on paper. You ride north to a settlement on the Amur where traders lace boots stiff with frost. The treaties that once set this river and the Ushuri as lines have given the realm a long coast that bends towards stone islands and salmon runs. Steamers push against the current in spring with stacks that thrum like drums. In winter, the river hardens and becomes a road with sleigh bells that measure distance in silver syllables. Cossacks stand their watch beside huts that smell of fish soup and drying felt. A Chinese merchant opens a chest of tea bricks and talks in numbers that make both sides smile. The border holds and breathes. You pass through St. Petersburg in a wet snow and step into an office where Sergei Witte plans without heat or haste. He reads charts of output and traffic. He writes programs for tariffs and loans and attracts mills that grow tall beside the Neva and the Dnieper. Bessemer steel pours like bright milk into molds. Factory whistles teach streets to begin earlier and end later. In the same city, a socialist circle whispers under lamps in a basement that smells of cabbage and fresh ink. The rails that feed industry also carry pamphlets. The empire strengthens itself and thins its patience in the same quarter hour. You travel south and east once more. A new line cuts across Manchurian Plain, a shortcut through the Chinese eastern lands that promises speed to the Pacific. Stations take on names that sound both Russian and Chinese. A concession grants timber, sidings, and depots. Engineers mark the ground with numbered stakes. Port Arthur becomes a fortified lease by a treaty drawn in bright offices that sit far from the smell of dust and fish. Ships anchor under hills where forts grow day by day. A winter sun glints against the water in a way that makes admirals speak softly. You feel tension in the air, the way a sailor feels a change in the wind. A rising island empire looks across the same sea and sees a continent of threats and chances. Ambassadors talk past one another. Advisors talk past their own doubts. In 1904, torpedoes find ships in a harbor before sunrise and make the decision real. The Russo-Japanese War begins with a sound that travels across the world. You stand on a ridge above Port Arthur and hear guns answer day after day. Earthworks run like scars along slopes that turn red after rain. Wounded men speak quietly at dusk so as not to jar their bandages. You ride north to a plain where winter light lies flat. The Battle of Mukden fills the horizon with smoke. Units pass through each other like currents that never fully blend. Trains bring shells along a single track that groans under the load. Supply wagons sink to their hubs in thawing lanes. Commanders measure ground with a ruler no longer matched to reality. The army withdraws with steadiness born of long habit. The line shortens, and the river of men keeps moving. You climb to a deck where the smell of tar and paint mixes with sea salt. Weeks of voyage have brought a Baltic fleet to a strait lined with fishing boats and cranes. The water narrows. Islands push in from both sides like patient onlookers. A fog lifts and reveals silhouettes that close with confidence. The battle in the Tsushima Strait breaks the line into pieces. Shell bursts carve fire out of spray. The day ends with masts sinking and flags hauled down. Survivors find ropes and prayers, and the dawn begins without the ships that carried them. You stand in a field tent where negotiators set papers in place. The treaty carries the name Portsmouth, and it writes reparations, leases, and the division of Sakhalin. The words are calm and final. Far away, families in fishing villages continue to mend nets. Children run along beaches with the same laughter as before. The war recedes from the horizon and remains in the bodies that return home with a different way of walking. You walk city streets where the result gnaws like a tooth that cannot be soothed. Newspapers show maps with arrows that point the wrong way. Veterans carry silence instead of stories. At the same time, trains continue to run. Vladivostok loads timber, fish, coal, and hope. Harbin grows streets that speak many tongues at once. A young clerk in a post office on the Amur stamps a letter with a firm hand and watches it vanish into a sack that will ride the great railway across continents. You let one uncertainty sit with you in the quiet after midnight. The argument over whether the single track of the main line doomed the army never settles. Another thought insists that policy chose too many ports and too many promises for the weight the realm could carry. A different thought sees a new kind of enemy, organized and quick, and says that this alone explained the end. You do not force the choice. You hold the puzzle as gently as a fragile cup and set it back on the shelf. You end the section in a station where snow taps iron like fine fingers. A samovar breathes on a bench. A porter sweeps a platform that smells of coal and faraway oranges from a crate that's split at the corner. A soldier in a greatcoat writes to a wife in perm and says the sea looked larger than he had expected. A conductor lifts a green flag. The engine answers with a low note. The Trans-Siberian carries the letter into the dark, and the realm carries its lessons into the next morning. Icons watch from compartment walls. Overhead, the carriage lamps swing in a rhythm that helps the traveler sleep. You wake to a city that keeps its lamps lit longer than usual, as if the evening itself wishes to read. Newsboys carry bundles through sleet. Factories hum with a tired rhythm that refuses to stop. In yards behind brick walls, machines turn and belts hiss. The air tastes of coal dust and steam. You walk past gates where guards stamp their feet and watch the faces of workers who have learned to count minutes and kopecks with a new care. Their coats shine where oil has soaked them. Their eyes hold the light of hope and the heaviness of winter. You follow a column that moves without anger and without fear. Icons ride at the front in careful hands. A portrait of the sovereign rises above the crowd. Hymns carry along the frozen street. Families keep step together. because they believe that faith and loyalty can bring mercy. The procession nears a square where soldiers wait with rifles held steady. Snow hangs in the air like a held breath. The first volley breaks the morning. Screams answer and then go quiet. The icon bearers bend and lift again. Men and women run, stumble, and rise. The day will take its name from blood spread across ice and stone. You stand at the edge of the square and feel a line inside the realm move from trust to hunger for change. You enter a tenement staircase where a samovar warms a landing because the rooms are too small to hold every visitor. A leaflet lies open beside the teapot. It speaks in strong words about hours and wages, about dignity at benches and in pits, about the right to speak without fear in halls that smell of grease and soap. A grandmother crosses herself as she pours. A young man reads aloud and pauses so that elders can follow. Language grows into decision on that landing. The meeting ends with quiet nods and a shared loaf. You ride a night train where every compartment whispers. Porters carry newspapers folded to hide headlines. Telegraph keys measure the distance between towns with taps that refuse to sleep. Strikes begin to move like weather across the line. A mill stops in one province and another follows 2 days later. Railway crews set their tools aside and lay their gloves on rails as if blessing them. Schedules fail. Silence replaces whistle. The empire hears that silence and understands that it is a sentence. You step into a port where the smell of tar and salt rises with heat from iron plates. A battleship rides at anchor and refuses to obey. Flags shift. A body lies beneath a canvas on the deck. The crew lifts his memory into a cause and raises anchors for a voyage that will be told in low rooms for years. The ship lowers a boat for water under a cliff of grain, and the city answers with cheers that sound like waves. Shots crack along the quay. The harbor fills with echo and smoke. A mutiny ends, and the sea goes on. The legend continues to work like yeast in the minds of men who load coal at dawn. You move through universities where corridors smell of ink and damp wool. Students fill lecture halls with a seriousness that comes from knowing that words can start factories and close them, can call meetings and answer rifles. A professor sets aside a classical text and speaks about justice with a calm that makes the room hold still. Outside, police watch from corners and write names in small books. Inside, a speaker asks for counsels that will speak for workers in a voice the state must hear. He is young and looks older than his years. He holds the room with sentences that rise and fall like bell peals. You enter a council chamber that is new to the city yet feels older than stone. Delegates arrive from yards and presses, from lines and mines. They sit on benches and listen to reports carried by tired men who speak with care. They choose committees for food, for security, for news, for negotiation. The word that describes them sounds simple and solid. It means table and also means council. It means a place where hands rest flat while minds try to make one plan. You watch the room discover authority made from attention rather than from uniforms. The discovery feels both fragile and inevitable. You cross provinces where peasants have long memories. The harvest has disappointed. Taxes bite. Land allotments draw thin lines that look narrow against large sky. In some villages, storehouses open because the rumor of change has reached the bench beneath the birch. In other villages, barns burn because anger reaches first. Priests try to calm with psalms. Gendarmes arrive with lists and leave with prisoners. The land listens to hooves and to prayers and cannot decide which sounds like the future. You return to the capital, where ministers sit over maps shaded in gray to mark the places where rails have fallen quiet. The sovereign signs a paper that promises a path toward law. It speaks of conscience and assembly and of a representative chamber to share the work of state. The ink dries and hope rises in a wave so quick it seems to lift the roofs. The October paper enters provinces on the same trains that have only just begun to move again. People stand in stations and read aloud to crowds who answer with tears and with cheers. You feel a door open. You visit a printing room where the first legal papers after the decree run through presses that smell of warm metal. Columns fill with arguments about schools and courts and the price of flour. A cartoonist draws a scene with a bear that pretends sleep while a child ties a ribbon on its ear. People laugh and feel brave. In a different quarter, other papers speak in a darker tone and carry calls to punish neighbors who pray with different words. The calls turn into nights that taste of ash and fear. You see lamps swing over alleys, hear glass break, and watch faces hide. The promise of liberty and the poison of hatred arrive in the same mailbag and cut each other without mercy. You enter the first chamber, chosen for national debate, and smell fresh paint on wood that will soon carry the marks of hands. The hall fills with men whose coats come from different tailors and whose books carry different creases. Speeches rise with conviction. Some call for land in new measures. Some call for stronger police to protect order. Some ask for schools where children will learn a language of law rather than a language of fear. The chamber works as if it were a mill that must break hard grain into flour. The sovereign watches and grows uneasy when the mill grinds too fast. The chamber dissolves, and the benches stand empty in the echoing room. You sit with a minister whose face looks carved from patience. He draws squares on a page to show farms that can grow on their own without the old communal tethers. He sets a date for ownership to harden into title if families choose. He orders roads to markets and credit for seed. He rides through villages and listens to sturdy men and women who stand in doorways with guarded eyes. Some accept the squares and build new fences. Some keep the bench beneath the birch and wait for spring. He also orders gallows and names them curiously. The year grows calmer under a discipline that tastes like ash. The countryside learns to fear midnight knocks even as fields begin to produce more. You walk through a December in Moscow where snow piles against barricades made from shutters and paving stones. Shots echo down side streets. Trams stand still and fill with frost. A church bell rings without a service. The uprising here burns shorter and hotter than talk in the capital had imagined. Soldiers close the alleys. The city returns to work with ashes in the gutters and a lesson folded into coat pockets. The lesson says that a promise can keep peace only if the hand that wrote it continues to write. You let one uncertainty rest in the quiet of a side chapel. No one can say with calm finality whether the promise of October rose from conviction in the palace or from pressure that left no alternative. No one can say with certainty which hands fired first on the winter morning when petitioners came with icons and songs. No one can weigh with exactness the share of blame held by men who believed that voices can be silenced by fear, and by men who believed that bombs can teach order. The truth refuses arithmetic. It remains scattered like ash that rides the wind and settles on many roofs. Night closes over a city that has learned both hope and caution. Workers fold blankets beside stoves that sing. Families kneel before icons and ask for a quieter year. A young officer reads the paper by lamplight and writes in his diary that a new chamber may yet teach the country how to speak. A peasant studies a deed to a small square of earth and measures with his eyes where the fence will run. You stand at a window and watch snow turn street lamps into soft moons. The realm has taken a step toward law and then a half step back. It breathes. It waits. It does not forget the day when faith walked toward rifles, nor the day when a promise in ink taught trains to move again. You wake to bugles that sound too bright for the hour. The summer of 1914 opens like a brass door. Crowds fill Nevsky Prospect with flags and hymns. Women pin ribbons on tunics that smell of wool and soap. Priests lift icons in morning light. A new name for the capital enters speech so that foreign syllables no longer cling to the stones. Petrograd breathes with a unity that feels like a shield. Trains gather under glass roofs and swallow regiments whole. You watch faces lean from windows with smiles that already look like memories. Steam climbs and hides their eyes. You ride east with cars stacked for war, rifles oiled, bread dark and dense in sacks. Birch and marsh slide by in pale strips. A telegraph sings its light metal song. Then the front begins with a sound like tearing cloth. You hear names for fields that will never leave recollection. Tannenberg writes itself into reports with sentences that taste of ash. Columns turn and vanish into pine. Prisoners line a road in a silence that speaks more than they can. The war becomes a season that refuses to change. You stand on a ridge near a town whose name will belong to a general who moves like a patient knife through tangled lines. The summer of 1916 lifts a brief hope as the Brussels of assault opens ground with a clean efficiency that surprises even its author. Gains come like hard loaves from a hot oven. They cool quickly. Ammunition thins. Horses fail. Men carry the field in their arms and cannot carry it any farther. The map changes by fingers and then stiffens again. The cost settles into hospitals where iodine clouds the air and letters home tear along creases made by shaking hands. You return to Petrograd in winter when coal scarcities sign their names on windows with frost. Queues bend along streets that smell of snow and yeast that never became bread. A woman in a kerchief counts coins that cannot command a loaf. A soldier's wife stands behind her and watches for a cart that will not come. You hear a chant that begins low and gathers courage as it moves. The day marked for women to honor work and home turns into a river of voices asking for bread and peace and a life that does not crush. The river swells. Trams stop. Police step back and then step aside. You cross a bridge into Viborg, where mills breathe steam. The garrison listens to the street as if it were a drum. Orders arrive with the usual tone and find shoulders that refuse to lift the rifle. Barracks open and send men into the cold with the city rather than against it. Officers stare at corridors that do not obey. You walk with a column that no longer knows which door counts as authority. Snow turns to slush under thousands of boots. The old order tries to speak and finds that voice has gone hoarse. You enter the Tauride Palace, where 2 rooms wake at once. In one, deputies gather and improvise a cabinet among portraits and velvet. In the other, workers and soldiers sit at long tables under bare bulbs and write themselves into being. Papers circulate that teach a new rule for barracks, where enlisted men choose committees to mind the conduct of arms. The 2 centers share a building and not a rhythm. You feel the pulse of dual life, a sober parlor and a noisy kitchen trying to feed the same house. Both rooms mean well. Both rooms grow tired. You ride a night train that halts under a station roof near Skoff. A carriage lamp turns the air honey yellow. Inside, a ruler signs away a throne that had learned his hand in boyhood. The date reads March 1917 by the calendar on the wall, and the pen writes the end of a dynasty that had blessed harvests and sent armies to borders for 300 years. A small cross rests on the table beside the inkstand. Outside, sleet rattles along the carriage windows. You feel a quiet that holds sadness and relief in the same breath. A guard wipes his eyes and then stands straighter. You step back into the city where uniforms try to learn a new salute. The word provisional enters ordinary talk. The sky over the Neva looks wider. Prisoners walk out of cells and blink. Newspapers multiply with a sudden springtime of fonts. Meetings happen in every hall and cellar. A lawyer, with a gift for words, learns to raise a crowd without raising his voice. He wears his fine suit like armor and believes that law can be taught before winter. He speaks of an assembly elected by all and of a nation kept whole by respect. The plan glows like a coal at dusk. You visit barracks where soldiers read newspapers instead of drill sheets. You visit villages where land looks close enough to touch, if only papers would allow hands to reach. You visit factories where whistles stutter and then fall silent because committees argue over shifts and pay while machines cool. The war continues to pull men and flour toward distant lines. The promise of a constitution moves too slowly for hungry rooms. In July, anger spills into streets like hot water. The government lives through the scald and survives, but it learns that patience can boil. You watch another current gather, cool and direct. A general rides in from the front with a face full of certainty, then sends orders that look like rescue to some, like a fist to others. Trains choke, telephones fail, loyalists hesitate. A city of printers and sailors and workers and soldiers answers with speed that outpaces his horse. The tide recedes. The general leaves a coat on a chair, and in its pocket lies a plan that no longer matters. A minister addicted to balance becomes harder and thinner at once. He still hopes that speeches can guide armies and that honor can bridle chaos. You stand in Smolny where halls smell of chalk and damp wool. A party that kept to corners now sits at long tables and writes motions with an economy learned underground. Their sentences travel out through courtyards and across bridges. They speak to people who will accept any door that opens away from war and away from hunger. They speak of land handed to those who till and of factories guided by hands that smear with grease every day. The voice is plain. The city hears it. You cross the river at night under a sky that has forgotten stars. Red lanterns wink from tugboats along the water. A cruiser lying in the dark answers a signal with a single round from its forward gun. The tone rolls along embankments and turns into a command the city already knew. Posts fall. Telegraph offices accept new guards with calm. The Winter Palace glows and then dims. Rooms fill with running feet and the crisp instruction of men who have rehearsed. A government is arrested by lamplight while nurses steady wounded on stairwells. The city wakes the next morning and pretends to continue because kitchens still need to boil and babies still need milk. You read the first decrees that promise to stop the war and hand fields to villagers who have already walked out to cut boundary stakes. You pass crowds that cheer as if they were relieved to hear a melody they can hum. You also pass doors that close quietly while people inside hide icons in papers and floorboards because the tone in the street no longer sounds like theirs. Newspapers shrink to fewer titles. Meetings learn to ask permission. The new order builds with the speed of a factory shift begun at dawn. You leave one question unsettled on your table. The winter that ended the crown also ended a war for which the land had never been ready to pay. You cannot count with certainty how much of the collapse belongs to shells that never arrived, to bread that never baked, to railways that could not carry both soldiers and flour, to leaders who trusted ceremony more than reading rooms, to parties that believed that speed alone was virtue. The answer moves like mist across the Neva and refuses to be held in the hand. Night gathers over a country that no longer calls itself an empire. In a small village, a woman stirs kasha and tells a child that new papers will one day mean a better school. In a cold cellar, a former officer stares at his gloves and thinks of a regiment that marched well and then vanished. In a city room, lit by a single bulb, a committee stamps forms that will decide the use of 100 looms. You stand at a window where the glass freezes in tiny flowers. The old flag has been folded. A new banner hangs where it can catch the least wind. The horizon glows faintly red, not with fire, but with the color of a morning that will change everything. Word count, 1100. Awaiting, continue. Night settles like velvet over the rivers and domes, and you feel the country grow quieter with each slow breath. Streets that once rang with iron and song now hold only the hush of snow and the soft creak of shutters. You walk through a garden that remembers many winters. Frost draws pale lace on the pond. A blackbird shifts in a bare branch and then grows still. Lamps glow behind curtains and turn windows into warm squares that float in the dark like small harbors. You stand and listen until the city's pulse becomes your own. You follow a lane toward a chapel where a single candle keeps its patient flame. The floor smells of beeswax and pine. Incense lingers in a thin ribbon of sweetness that rises and vanishes near the vault. Icons watch with steady faces that do not ask and do not judge. You bow your head and let the silence ease your shoulders. Far away, a train crosses a bridge, and the sound runs along the rails like a thread that ties distances into one cloth. The thread fades, and the stillness returns. You step into fields beyond the last houses. Snow holds the memory of hoof and boot, and then smooths it away. A barn light burns like a star close to earth. Somewhere a gate closes with a friendly click. The night accepts everything and keeps nothing sharp. History loosens its armor and becomes a story told beside a stove, gentle in tone and long in comfort. You breathe, and the breath leaves white and disappears. You turn toward home. A kettle hums. A blanket waits with its ordinary kindness. The room is warm enough, and the window is cool enough to remind you of the sky. Your eyes grow heavy, and your hands grow calm. The past settles like feather snow and asks nothing more of you. And now, you may drift into dreams of history. End of script. Sweet dreams.